Good morning, Morai Rabotai. We're continuing on Shulchan Aruch Orach Chaim, and we are up to the last Siman of Hilchot Kriyat Shema, Siman Pehet. And Maran writes, Kol hatameim korim b'Torah v'korim Kriyat Shema u'mitpalelin, that all of the people who are tameh, one way or another, they could still daven, say Shema, learn, chutz mi bal keri. Aside from one exception, who is a Baal Keri, someone that has experienced similar mission, which is a Takanat Ezra, mentioned in Masechet Baba Kama. The Gemara there brings the Takanot of Yeshua, Takanot of Ezra, Daf Pe Aleph and Daf Pe Bet in Masechet Baba Kama. And one of the 10 Takanot of Ezra was that a Baal Keri should not be able to read Dvarim Shebikdusha, should not engage in learning Torah or Tefillah prior to using the mikveh. The primary reason for that was to have a certain level of healthy abstinence and pre-shoot in the area of sexual engagements. Therefore, this was a takana that was accepted in some places, was not practical in others, and became a takana that was mitbatel. It became nullified in many places. Now Rambam writes that some of the countries, some of the areas, they accepted and embraced the takana of Ezra. Others were not able to keep it. Hence, Rambam depends really where you're from. He answers this in a letter, I believe it was to Rabbi Pinchas Dayan, the Dayan of Alexandria in Mitzrayim, who asked him, why did you omit and skip the mitzvah of Takanat Ezra, the mitzvah of Tefillah? You didn't even bring a concept in your Yad HaChazakah. Rambam answers, he says, because my work of Yad HaChazakah is a chibur. I mention things that are halachic concepts, not things that depend on the minhag. And writes the Rambam, this, because it was not accepted by all of Klal Yisrael, it becomes something that is talui on the minhag. Like the Rishonim write in Masechet Avodah Zarah, Daf Lamed Hey, that by certain takanot, again, we keep certain takanot of the Rabbanan when it comes to interactions we have with the Gentiles as far as the food is concerned. There's a takana of bishul akum, takana of pat akum, and there was a takana of shemen akum, which was not accepted. And the Ramban, the Ran, over there in Masechet Avodah Zarah explain when a takana, when a rabbinic institution really catches, and when it doesn't. In the case of machale akum, shemen akum did not catch, and pat akum became a debatable subject, because some areas, some countries accepted pat akum, and some others, it was not practical for them to not use a commercially baked, we're talking about pat nachtum, a commercially baked item. So therefore, there's machloket. So Maran Shulchan Aruch writes, for instance, in Yoreh De'ah, in Siman Kuf Yud Bet, that a pat palter, a person should not use even a commercially baked, unless, again, you have nothing available. And then in Sif Dalet, Sif Hey, Maran writes that if equivalent of that is not available, so then it's a different heter. But nevertheless, it really depends on whether or not the takana was accepted. So Rambam writes, for instance, myself, in the countries of Babylonia, in Shinar and in Sfarad, the takana of Ezra was accepted and embraced, and hence writes the Rambam, I myself never in my life nullified takanat Ezra unless I was sick. I always used the mikveh when I needed it, when he was considered halachically a Baal Keri, unless he was ill. So this is something very interesting when it comes to this topic, because Maran only brings the halachic part of it, that a Baal Keri shehotzio Ezra mikol hatemeim, that the exception to all the tames that a regular person that's tameh, even tameh mit, even the highest of the levels of tumah, you could still daven, learn, say Shema, but Baal Keri, Ezra took him out of the klal of other tameim and said, this person cannot read or learn, whether it is in reading Shema and saying Tefillah or learning, until he goes to mikveh. And the reason behind it was to enforce a certain healthy level of abstinence in this area. But afterwards it was nullified, this takana of Ezra, and now we do it as the halacha requires, that even a Baal Keri could learn Torah and could say Shema and Tefillah, below Tefillah, ubelo rechitza tisha kabin, without Tefillah or even Tisha kabin, which is the next best for Baal Keri. If you can't go to mikveh, you could have Tisha kabin of water poured on you, bevat achat, which again becomes a subject of machloket, whether or not showers nowadays will be sufficient. If you have a nice strong flow of water and you go to take a nice shower for 5-10 minutes, would that be equivalent of Tisha kabin for a Baal Keri, which many actually do that in lieu of mikveh? V'chen pashad minhag, and that is the minhag, says the Mechaber, says Maran Shulchan Aruch.
Tisha kabin again, 4 gallons or 4 liters?
Tisha kabin becomes about 13 liters of, I think, or maybe I'm off with the cheshbon. I have to do it again, but it's a few minutes of a strong shower, a strong flow of shower, that would be, again, if showers are fine, that would be sufficient. So says the Ramah, Yesh katvu she'en leisha nida b'meriyata. There are those who say that a nida should not also come to Bet Knesset or daven or mention Hashem's name, and there are those who disagree with that. Right? The Ramah, the minhag is, in Ashkenaz, we're talking about the minhag of the Ashkenazim, that the minhag, he says, is kisvara rishona, that people, even though that halacha, the ikar halacha, says the Ramah, is to be lenient, that a nida could come to shul, could daven, could touch the sefarim, and so on. But it says the minhag in Ashkenaz was to be machmir, but then he says, well, in Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, those days that everyone comes to shul, then everyone is lenient. Now, this is a minhag that some of the Sephardi countries, Persian communities also were mindful of, but again, as we develop this, we'll discuss it Be'ezrat Hashem as well. So it says, the Mishnah Berura, V'gam ki akri ba mikalut rosh. The reason is not just because that to impose abstinence, the takana of Ezra, was also because Keri comes from kalut rosh, and divrei Torah sarich liyot be'ema ve'yira beretet v'ziyah kemo be'ed netilata. Divrei Torah has to be learned with seriousness, and Keri usually comes from lightheadedness. So therefore, this is a specific tumah that Ezra Sofer wanted to put a certain healthy boundary around it, and the reason that Maran Shulchan Aruch chose to write the first reason only, the Kaf HaChaim says, is because even nowadays Talmidei Chachamim should be machmir, not to be metzuim etzel neshotem k'tar negolim, even though that the Takarat Ezra is nullified. So therefore, says the Kaf HaChaim, Shulchan Aruch is saying this because even though that the Takarat Ezra is not there, the tam of it still is very much alive, and we should be something to be careful about. Now, afterwards, this takana was mitbatel. Says the Mishnah Berura, someone that wants to do it, tava alav bracha, he will be blessed. There's different levels of kedusha, of course, and tahara. Of course, we're talking about the case that you're not missing Zman Kriyat Shema through this. if a person is going to put the chumrah ahead of halacha, then of course something seriously is wrong with their avodat Hashem. You wanted to go to mikveh, beautiful, very nice. But if you're going to miss even Zman Kriyat Shema Magen Avraham, then of course everything that you did was not worth at all. Because again, the takara halachically is not binding, according to Shulchan Aruch. And therefore, if you're missing Zman Kriyat Shema because you think that you're not tahor and you want to be machmir for takanat Ezra, so you don't want to say Shema until you go to Tevilah, and hence you're missing out the Zman of Kriyat Shema, that would be, of course, not the right decision. So, now, even though that Chazal were mebatel, the takanat Ezra, or it became nullified, and they allowed the Baal Keri to learn Torah and to daven without Tevilat Ezra, but there are those who write that learning the Torah of Sod, if a person wants to involve themselves in learning the higher levels of Torah, Torah Sod, then you have to be very careful in this this area of Tumah Ta'ara. This is Rabbi Yaakov Moshe Hillel put out a Sefer Merkav Siel, and in it he brings many sources that indicate that the person that wants to learn Nistar, Torah Nistar, has to be very careful in the areas of Tahara, and Taharat HaMikveh is one of those big things. Now, nowadays, we are all Tamei Met, and Tamei Met, there's no way around it. Once you become Tamei Met, you can't undo it without Efer Paraduma, which we don't have nowadays, unfortunately. So all of us basically are Tamei Met. If you have ever attended a funeral, you are probably Tamei Met. If you have been going to visit people in the hospitals, especially in hospitals who are populated with the Jewish community, you are probably Tamei Met. So we, generally speaking, assume not only that, if you pass under a tree, which the other half of it is over a cemetery, Jewish cemetery, you also are Tameh because of Tumat Ohel. So many different ways that the person could become Tameh. We, generally speaking, assume that all of us are Tameh Met. So even though the Tameh Met is the highest level, highest form of Tumah, but nevertheless, the Ben Ish Chai writes in Torah Lishma, we generally speaking assume that the Torah Lishma was anonymously written by the Ben Ish Chai, that this Tevilah of Baal Keri still helps from Tumat Keri, even though that it doesn't help for Tumat Met, but it helps for the lower level of Tumah of a Baal Keri, and is not considered a Tovel v'Sheretz Biyado. It's not considered like a person that has the source of Tumah in his hand and goes to mikveh, which the mikveh doesn't do anything. Here, what you could accomplish, you could get rid of Tumat Keri with the Tevilah, good. You still have Tumat Met on you, fine. But still it helps for Tumat Keri, writes the Torah Lishma.
We all assume that we're all Tamei Met anyways. Is there any reason to avoid possibly becoming Tamei Met again? Like not going out of your way not to go to a cemetery or not to go to a hospital?
Well, it all depends. If you have a mitzvah of Lvayat Met, there's no reason. Yeah, but for no reason you should not go to the Beit HaKnesset. It's a makom of Tumah. And the less Tumah you have, the better it is. Yeah, but if you're contrasting that with a mitzvah, of course do the mitzvah. If you have a Met mitzvah or you have a regular Levayat Met, the Braita says in Masechet Ketuvot Daf Yud Zayin that there's no shiur really for how many people should be participating in a funeral. It's a kavod amet, it's a mitzvah of chesed, after achakav, many mitzvot that you could do. So do them. But if you have no reason, it just because, then of course, the less tumah you have on you, the better it is. It spiritually negatively affects a person, of course. So says the Mishnah Berura, why did they nullify this takana. שהייתה גזרה שאין רוב הציבור יכולים לעמוד בה. This was a difficult גזרה. Most of the community could not really stand in this level of takana, and therefore, even though that the Beit Din cannot nullify divrei Beit Din chavero אלא אם כן גדול ממנו בחוכמה ובמניין. Usually a Beit Din cannot nullify another takana of a different Beit Din unless this recent Beit Din is higher level Beit Din than the previous one, which usually we don't have in generations going down. Usually the generations before were higher level. So here it should not be mutar. So the Kaf HaChaim says that the takana of Tevilat Ezra was not nitpashta b'kol Yisrael. This is what the Ran writes in Masechet Avodah Zarah that I just mentioned before, that if you have a takana that was not well spread throughout Klal Yisrael, then you could have a different Beit Din to nullify it if they feel that the majority of Tzibur cannot do the takana. And this is such a case. It was not nitpashet b'kol Yisrael. Not everybody agreed and accepted takana Ezra, and a Beit Din saw that this is something that people cannot do. Imagine in the winter, before you had mikvaot, before you had like warm, nice, indoor, heated mikvaot, to use a mikveh meant to go to the bor, to go to a river, and break the ice, and go in, and try not to have a heart attack. And it was not a simple task necessarily. It was not...
The women were doing it.
Yeah, but again, the women were doing it once a month. But if a person has to do it twice a week, then it becomes much more difficult and impractical when you have to, early morning before you daven, and their minyan was, well, you think they had a minyan of Benem Melachim, like an 8:30 minyan, chas v'shalom. Right, 8:30 would be like considered like noon time. People were up and running from 5 o'clock a.m. and they davened nets. Everybody davened early. So now imagine the dark of the day, night, early the day before dawn, you have to go break some ice and go to the river with all the dangers that could be involved with it. It's not a practical thing necessarily. And you're not talking about like a controlled environment that you could pour hot water in it necessarily. Not every mikveh was like that. Yeah, you had some mikveh like that. But even that, they didn't have an internal heater. So you had to heat up water to pour it inside the mikveh and kind of take the edge out of the cold to be able to jump in. But for that you had to create fire. And then you had to boil water. And you had to carry the hot boiling water. And all that you have to do before you miss the minyan. Or Zman Kriyat Shema. So wasn't something that rove, when talking about a majority of Klal Yisrael, it was hard for them to do this. So it says, the Kaf HaChaim, it says a gezerah that was not nitpashet b'kol Yisrael. Not everyone. Rambam says, Areshin accepted it. Rambam says Sfarad accepted it. Most of the Sfaradim, it seems like, they accepted this. But it was not nitpashet b'kol Yisrael. And a takana that was not nitpashta b'kol Yisrael, we have leeway to do without it if it becomes a gezerah that the understanding of the later Beit Din is en rov hatzibur yacholim la'amod bo. It's a difficult thing, so therefore they nullified it.
But why wouldn't that be the same thing as Shemin? Shemin is like totally like nobody even has a hint of that nowadays. So that also wasn't like, so what certain places maybe it's stuck, but literally nobody is holding to that. Why isn't that the same thing?
Same thing that what?
As
it is the same thing.
But Rabbi saying that
here you have reasons to keep it, says the Kaf HaChaim, and that's why Shulchan Aruch brings it, because the reason behind why it was instituted is still very much alive in the Takana of Shemen. If you're the only person that's doing it, is not really going to do much, and again, it's not something that ever caught on. Over here, and by Pat Akum is a little bit more, because some parts of it were accepted by everyone. For instance, the Pat Baal Habayit was accepted by everyone. If somebody makes, your neighbor, next door neighbor has a baking experience, or they've been bored in COVID time, and they started like developing the sourdoughs, and now they want you to experience their sourdough. It became like a baking privately at home and selling it online became like a thing recently, and it's happening in communities around the Jewish communities and non-Jewish communities. They're, on social media, they are actually advertising it and selling it. So this became a big thing. Whereas previously this was not such a big item. Now you have a serious question of your neighbor making the same thing, because people got into making sourdoughs and doughs and baking. So if they made something privately and they bring a sample to you, because you're their next door neighbor, that according to everyone is asur, even though that the ingredients is kasher, even if you were standing there, you made it together in their house, right? So that becomes something that already was accepted, but here in this area was not really accepted, and on top of it is a takana she'en rov hatzibur yacholim la'amod bo, so therefore it was nullified, right?
But you're really saying the Sephardi countries is kind of stuck, so it's not nullified.
Those, again, Rambam writes that this depends on the minhag. Yeah. So if you are coming from a place that there was a clear minhag, that Takanat Ezra was accepted, then you cannot go against it. And Maran writes the same thing by Pat Palter as well. It says those places that this became accepted, you have to be careful for Pat Palter as well, for a commercially baked goods as well. Hence the Sfaradim are machmir. Like, when you have available pat for, according to Maran, I think it's Ifdalet there in Siman Kuf Yud Bet of Yoredeah, if you have available pat Israel, it's asur to have pat palter. Even commercially baked goods, there will be prohibited when you have available pat Israel. So nowadays that becomes a very big thing, because Baruch Hashem, in larger Jewish communities, you have multiple bakeries. So usually you have all the basic needs of baked items, baked goods, in the Jewish bakeries that are Pat Israel, and that would prohibit a person from being able to just go and purchase a regular bread off the shelves, even if it has kosher symbols, because the Sfaradim have to be more mindful of that. Of course, Hasidim are very much stringent on that as well. Now there is, we're not really trying to do a Chol Kriyat Shema, but once we're at it, Maran in Seif Hey has a leniency of when you absolutely don't have equivalent of that bread, the quality. So someone, for health reasons, for other reasons, have to have a very specific bread, and you don't have the equivalent of that in Pat Israel, that already is considered in Pat Mitzuyalo, that Pat Israel is not common, is not found, so therefore you could be lenient even if you have other types and qualities of Pat Israel available. But nevertheless, says the Mishnah Berura over here, המנהג ומכל מקום יש אנשי מעשה שנוהגים בתקנה זו וטובלין את עצמן לקריאן. There are אנשי מעשה that are מחמיר on טבילת עזרא, and they go to mikveh before, when they become a Baal Keri, before davening or learning, ואם קשה עליהם הטבילה רוחצין את עצמן, and if it's hard to do טבילה, at least they do תשעה קבין. And the Achronim write, the Poskim write, ש40 סע מים שאובים כשרים לתפילה. That even for this tefillah, even if you have a swimming pool, even if you have a hot tub, right, that is מים שאובים, the 40, if you have 40 סע מים שאובים, which is again machloket exactly how much it is, the Bet Yosef in Siman Resh Aleph of Yoredein, the beginning of Hilchot Mikvaot, discusses what exactly is memsa according to different Rishonim and different Cheshbonot. But if you have memsa water, then even though that's Mayim Sheuvim, it's kasher for Tevilah of men, for Tevilat Ezra. V'chen Tisha Kabin hu gam ken b'Mayim Sheuvim. Even Tisha Kabin could be Mayim Sheuvim. V'afiru mishlosha kelim. Even it could be from 3 different vessels. It doesn't have to be Tisha Kabin in one vessel. It could be at the minimum of shlosha kabin, so it could be from 3 different kelim, ubeofen shelo yafsik mishfichat keli, in a way that you don't stop the pouring from one keli to another, so you start the second one pouring on his head before the first one stops, and so on. But more than 3 vessels is not good for Tisha Kabin. Again, nowadays you don't have a person holding and pouring water on your head from a bucket. Usually you have a shower, which again we're going to discuss it with Zat Hashem in the days to come. We're going to discuss some of the details of the modern day era mikvaot for men, swimming pools, and hot tubs, showers, and all that, B'ezrat Hashem, in the next shiur.